Deep in Montana's snow-covered forest, Ranger Luke Morgan's lonely existence was about to change forever. Weathered by years of solitude and the harsh wilderness he protected, Luke had learned to keep his distance from both people and the wild creatures that roamed his territory. But on that bitter winter night, something pulled him toward the faint whimpering coming from beyond the tree line. The wolf cub's mangled paw, caught in a rusted trap, would test everything he believed about the boundary between man and beast. What he couldn't know was how this simple act of mercy would forge a bond more powerful than the ancient wilderness itself. Would this mysterious connection between man and wolf become Luke's salvation or his undoing? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first light of dawn barely penetrated the frost-covered windows of Luke Morgan's cabin. He'd been awake for hours already, sitting at his wooden table, a steaming mug of black coffee warming his weathered hands. 15 years in these mountains had etched deep lines into his face. Matching the topographical maps spread before him, Luke reached for the brass compass in his pocket, a habit so ingrained he sometimes did it in his sleep. The needle quivered, then settled, always finding true north. If only life's direction were so reliable. Another day in paradise, he muttered to no one, his voice rough from disuse. The radio crackled to life. "Base to Morgan." "Come in, Morgan." Luke sighed, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders before responding. "Morgan here." "Go ahead, Base. Jack's heading your way with supplies." "ETA Nun. Also reports of increased activity in Sector 7. Possible poachers, copy that." "I'll check it out." Luke moved to the window, watching as the sun painted the snow-covered pines gold. His territory, his responsibility. 10,000 acres of Montana wilderness that most people would never see. Just how he liked it. The shadow of a hawk passed overhead as Luke stepped onto his porch, breath clouding in the crisp air. He checked his rifle, more out of habit than necessity. In 15 years, he'd fired it exactly twice at humans, warning shots both times. The wilderness had rules. Luke was just their enforcer. His truck protested in the cold, but eventually rumbled to life. The Forest Service vehicle had seen better days, much like its driver. As he navigated the narrow fire road, Luke's gaze caught on the photograph tucked into the dashboard, the one memento he allowed himself. Sarah and Lily, smiling on their last camping trip. Before the accident, Luke turned away, focusing on the road ahead. By midday, the sun had done little to warm the air when a battered pickup appeared around the bend. Luke pulled over, allowing Jack Peterson to do the same. "You look like hell." "Morgan," Jack called as he climbed out, his breath visible in the cold. "Nice to see you too," Luke replied. The closest thing to a smile tugging at his mouth. Jack was 50-something, bearded, and the closest thing Luke had to a friend these days. He made the supply run from town once every 2 weeks, bringing necessities and unwanted news in equal measure. "Brought your usual," Jack said, handing over a box of provisions. "Plus some interesting gossip," Luke grunted, loading the box into his truck. "Save it. You might want to hear this one. Town council's considering expanding hunting permits in your area. Pressure from developers." Luke's jaw tightened. "More hunters means more problems. That's not all," Jack continued, leaning against his truck. 3 hikers reported seeing an unusually large wolf pack last week. Got people nervous. Wolves mind their business if people mind theirs. Jack studied Luke's face. "You ever get tired of it? Being out here alone?" Luke's hand found the compass again, thumb tracing its worn edge. "Not everyone's built for company." "Been 7 years, Luke." 8. The correction came automatically. Jack nodded, knowing better than to push. "Well, there's a new vet in town. Sarah something. Specializes in wildlife." "Seems nice." Luke ignored the implication. "I need to check those reports in Sector 7. Thanks for the supplies." As Jack drove away, Luke stood motionless, watching until the truck disappeared. The silence returned, broken only by the whisper of wind through pine needles. This was why he'd chosen this life. The simplicity, the solitude, the distance from anything that could hurt again. He pulled out his map, marking the area with reported poaching activity. Sector 7 bordered private land, always a problem area. As he traced the boundary line with his finger, a distant howl echoed through the trees. Wolf, probably marking territory. Luke glanced up, scanning the tree line. Something felt different today. The forest held its breath as if waiting. He shook off the sensation, chalking it up to Jack's unwelcome news. The compass weighed heavy in his pocket as he climbed back into his truck. North was still north. His duty was still his duty. Nothing had changed. Yet as he drove deeper into the forest, Luke couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to. The town of Pinecrest wasn't much, a handful of streets clustered around a main drag that hadn't changed since the 70s. Luke avoided it when possible, which was most of the time. Today wasn't optional. The Forest Service office occupied a small building near the edge of town. Luke parked his truck and steeled himself for human interaction. Inside, a blast of warm air carried the smell of coffee and copy paper. "Look what the mountain coughed up," District Supervisor Hank Mitchell called from behind his desk. "Twice in 1 month, Morgan. People will talk. Reports ready?" Luke asked, ignoring the attempt at humor. Hank slid a folder across the desk. "Poaching activities up 15% from last year. State's concerned. I'm concerned," Luke corrected, flipping through the paperwork. "State just counts numbers." "State signs your paycheck," Luke grunted. Hank was career Forest Service, counting days until retirement. He'd never understood Luke's dedication to the actual forest. "There's something else," Hank said, lowering his voice. "Commercial interest in Sector 5. Luxury hunting lodge. Very hush-hush," Luke's jaw tightened. "Sector 5 was prime habitat, untouched for decades. Not happening on my watch. Might not be your call, Morgan. Progress and all that." After escaping the office, Luke forced himself to complete his town errands. General store for supplies. They didn't trust Jack to select correctly. Hardware store for parts to fix the generator. Finally, the clinic. The bell chimed as he entered the veterinary office. The waiting room was empty, except for an elderly man with a cat carrier. Luke nodded in greeting and approached the reception desk. "Ranger Morgan, for Dr. Collins." The receptionist smiled with familiar recognition. "She's expecting you." "Go on back." Luke found Sarah Collins in the lab, peering through a microscope. At 38, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone comfortable in their expertise. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, a few strands escaping around her face. "The blood work confirms rabies," she said without looking up. "Third case this month. Location? Near Miller's Creek, same as the others." She finally glanced up, her brown eyes meeting his. "This is becoming a pattern, Luke." He set his folder on her desk. "I marked the locations. All within 2 miles of each other." Sarah studied the map. "Could be a single infected predator. Wolf, coyote, or mountain lion. If it's a wolf, I need to know. Pack could spread it fast." She nodded, understanding the implications. As the regional wildlife veterinarian, Sarah worked closely with the Forest Service, but her connection with Luke went deeper. They shared a dedication to the wilderness that few others understood. "How are you sleeping?" she asked suddenly, her eyes on the dark circles under his. Luke shrugged. "Fine." Sarah reached for a drawer and pulled out a small bottle. "Try these. Herbal, not prescription. Might help with the nightmares." "I don't—" "Luke," she cut him off. "I've known you 6 years. You only come to town when absolutely necessary. You live alone in the woods. You avoid people at all costs." She pushed the bottle toward him. "I'm not asking you to talk about it. Just sleep." He pocketed the bottle, knowing he wouldn't use it. The nightmares were the tax he paid for his choices. "Any other signs of unusual wildlife activity?" he asked, changing the subject. Sarah hesitated. "Actually, yes. Thomas Blackfeather brought in a plaster cast of a wolf print yesterday. Biggest I've ever seen. Location? Near your cabin, actually. Northern boundary." Something cold settled in Luke's stomach. "Did he see the animal?" "Just tracks. Said they appeared overnight after the storm." She studied his reaction. "Why, you seen something?" "No." The lie came easily. "Just monitoring predator movements." Back in his truck, Luke sat motionless, staring at the prescription bottle Sarah had given him years ago, now empty. He'd stopped using the pills when they made him too drowsy to wake at the first sound of trouble. In the wilderness, deep sleep could be dangerous. The new herbal remedy rattled in his pocket as he started the engine. Thomas Blackfeather tracking wolf prints near his cabin was concerning. The old man knew these forests as well as Luke did, maybe better. His people had lived here for centuries before there was a forest service or a town called Pinecrest. As Luke drove toward the reservation, snow began to fall again, large flakes settling on the windshield. Winter was digging in its heels, refusing to yield to spring. Just like the past, refused to release its grip on him. The blizzard hit without warning. One minute Luke was driving along the Forest Service road, the next he was crawling through a white void, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle. The Weather Service had predicted a light snowfall, not this fury of nature. Perfect, Luke muttered, squinting through the whiteout. He was in Sector 7, at least 10 miles from his cabin, investigating the reported poaching activity. Now his primary concern was avoiding getting stuck, or worse, sliding off the narrow mountain road. The truck's tires lost traction on a curve. Luke corrected, but not quickly enough. The rear end fishtailed, sending him into a slow-motion slide toward the edge. He braced for impact as the vehicle left the road, crunching through underbrush before halting abruptly against a pine tree. Luke sat motionless, assessing. Nothing broken. The truck seemed intact, but hopelessly stuck. He checked his watch, 3:17 p.m., maybe 2 hours of daylight left. In this weather, nobody would come looking until morning at the earliest. His training kicked in. The temperature was dropping rapidly. Staying with the vehicle was safer, but his cabin was closer than the nearest outpost. Luke gathered his emergency pack, radio, rifle, and extra ammunition. He pulled on additional layers, checked his map and compass, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical blow. Wind drove the snow horizontally, stinging any exposed skin. Luke oriented himself using his compass and began the long trek homeward, following game trails where possible. An hour into the journey, the wind shifted. Through the howling gale, a different sound reached him, high-pitched, distressed. Luke paused, listening. There it was again, a whimpering cry, barely audible. Every instinct told him to keep moving. Daylight was fading. The temperature was plummeting. But that sound... Luke altered his course, tracking the noise to a small clearing. At first, he saw nothing through the curtain of snow. Then a flash of movement caught his eye. Near the base of a dead tree, something small thrashed weakly. Drawing closer, the scene came into focus. A wolf cub, no more than a few months old, its rear paw clamped in the vicious teeth of a steel trap. Blood stained the snow around it, shockingly red against the white. "Damn," Luke whispered. The trap was illegal, a toothed leg-hold type banned for decades. The kind that poachers still used because they were effective and silent. The cub froze at his approach, golden eyes wide with terror. Luke crouched, keeping his movements slow. He'd seen trapped animals before, knew how they could lash out in fear and pain. But this cub seemed beyond fighting. Its small body trembled, breath coming in ragged pants. The trapped leg was badly mangled, bone visible where the steel teeth had torn through flesh. The humane thing would be to end its suffering. One quick shot. The cub wouldn't feel a thing. Luke's hand moved to his holster, then stopped. Instead, he reached for the hunting knife at his belt, his father's knife, the handle worn smooth from years of use. The same knife his father had used to teach him that taking a life was sometimes necessary, but never simple. "Easy now," Luke murmured, his voice low and steady as he approached. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The cub's ears flattened against its head, a feeble growl rumbling in its chest. Luke positioned himself carefully, then pressed down on the trap's release mechanism. The springs were stiff with cold, requiring all his strength. With a metallic snap, the jaws opened. The cub didn't move. Whether from fear or weakness, it remained where it was, golden eyes fixed on Luke. Up close, its injury looked even worse. Without medical attention, infection would set in if the cold didn't take it first. "You're not giving me many options here," Luke told it. Making a decision, He shrugged out of his outer jacket and gently wrapped the cub, careful of its injured paw. It weighed almost nothing in his arms, a bundle of bones and matted fur. He felt its rapid heartbeat against his chest as he secured it inside his coat, leaving its head free. The light was fading fast now, and the temperature with it. Luke rechecked his compass and resumed his trek toward home, now burdened with the injured cub. The storm showed no signs of abating, snow piling deeper with each step. With one arm cradling his unlikely cargo, Luke pushed forward into the gathering darkness. Survival had just become twice as complicated. The last mile to the cabin nearly broke him. Luke's legs burned with exhaustion, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he pushed through snowdrifts reaching his thighs. The wolf cub had gone still inside his jacket. Whether sleeping or unconscious, he couldn't tell. When the cabin's silhouette finally emerged through the curtain of snow, Luke felt a relief so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. The temperature had plummeted to well below zero, and the first symptoms of hypothermia had begun to set in. Mental fogginess, uncontrollable shivering, clumsy movements, his fingers numb with cold, fumbled with the keys before managing to unlock the door. Inside, the cabin was cold, but blissfully free of wind. Luke's training took over. First priorities, heat, then medical attention. He laid the cub gently on a blanket near the wood stove, then got a fire going with mechanical efficiency. Only when flames began to lick at the dry pine did he allow himself to remove his frozen outer layers. The cub hadn't moved. In the light of the cabin, Luke could see how young it truly was, maybe 3 months old, still with the oversized paws of a growing animal. Its fur was a mix of grey and tawny, its injured leg caked with blood and dirt. Luke retrieved his extensive first aid kit from the bathroom cabinet. Over the years, he'd supplemented the standard Forest Service supplies with veterinary items, Sarah's influence. He'd treated injured wildlife before, though usually only to stabilize them until Sarah could take over. "Let's see what we're dealing with," he murmured, keeping his voice calm and low. The cub's eyes flickered open as Luke gently examined the injured paw. It was bad. The trap had crushed bone and torn through muscle. Even with treatment, the cub might never run properly again. Without treatment, infection would kill it within days. Luke prepared a solution of warm water and antiseptic. "This is gonna sting," he warned. As he began cleaning the wound, the cub whimpered but made no attempt to bite. Its eyes, startling gold in the firelight, remained fixed on Luke's face, holding a wary intelligence that unsettled him. Once the wound was clean, Luke carefully splinted the damaged leg and wrapped it in gauze. The cub would need antibiotics. He had a limited supply of broad-spectrum medications in his kit, technically for human use. But they would have to do. Luke crushed a pill, mixed it with a little water and raw meat from his refrigerator, and offered it to the cub. To his surprise, it lapped up the mixture, hunger overcoming caution. With the immediate medical concerns addressed, Luke finally attended to his own needs. He changed into dry clothes, made a strong cup of coffee, and radioed in a status report. The storm had knocked out most communications, but he managed to get through to base long enough to report his truck's location and that he was safely at his cabin. He made no mention of the wolf cub. As the night deepened, the storm's fury increased. Wind howled around the cabin's eaves, rattling the windows. Luke added wood to the fire and settled into his chair, keeping watch over his unexpected guest. The cub had fallen into an exhausted sleep, its small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. In sleep, it looked remarkably like a domestic dog pup, the predator not yet visible in its soft features. Luke's thoughts drifted to Sarah. She would know exactly what to do, but the storm made travel impossible. And even if he could reach her, bringing a wild wolf cub into town would raise questions he wasn't prepared to answer. Why had he saved it? The practical choice would have been a merciful bullet, yet something in those golden eyes had stopped him, a will to live that matched his own stubborn refusal to surrender. "Just for tonight," he told the sleeping cub. "In the morning we'll figure something out." He dozed in the chair, waking periodically to check on the fire and the cub. Around midnight, he awoke to find the animal watching him, its eyes reflecting the firelight. "You're a survivor," Luke said softly. "I'll give you that." Outside, a long howl rose above the storm's voice, deep, mournful, questioning. The cub's ears pricked forward, its body tensing. Luke moved to the window, peering out into the swirling white darkness. Nothing was visible beyond the porch. The howl came again, closer this time, the mother searching for her lost cub. Or perhaps the pack, calling one of their own. Luke returned to his chair, suddenly aware of the complexity of what he'd done. He hadn't just saved an injured animal. He'd intervened in the natural order of things, something he'd sworn never to do. Luke woke with a start, momentarily disoriented. Sunlight streamed through the cabin windows, revealing a room transformed by the night's events. His clothes were still draped by the fire, the first aid kit open on the table, and the blanket where he'd placed the wolf cub. Empty. He bolted upright, scanning the room. No sign of the cub. The cabin door remained firmly shut, all windows intact. Impossible for such a small, injured animal to have escaped on its own. A quick search confirmed what seemed unbelievable. The cub was gone. Luke stepped outside onto his porch. The storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape. 3 feet of pristine snow blanketed everything, glistening under a clear blue sky. Luke followed the trail with his eyes to the tree line. The small tracks emerged from his cabin, joined the larger ones, and together they disappeared into the forest. Adult wolf prints, unmistakably. But the size was all wrong, too large for any wolf he'd encountered in 15 years of rangering. Something prickled at the back of his neck, an instinct older than rational thought. He was being watched. Luke scanned the forest edge methodically, looking for any hint of movement. Nothing, yet the feeling persisted. Back inside, he radioed for a truck recovery team, then gathered his gear for a patrol. His mind kept returning to those tracks, the small ones limping away, the massive ones coming to meet them. The mother wolf coming for her cub. But those prints were larger than any female wolf should be. By afternoon, Luke had reached the spot where his truck had slid off the road. The recovery crew was already at work, winching the vehicle back onto the roadway. "Got yourself stuck good, Morgan," called Denton, the senior recovery technician. "Lucky you weren't far from home." Luke nodded, inspecting his truck for damage. "Any reports of unusual wildlife activity after the storm?" "Funny you should ask. Thomas Blackfeather was in the station this morning, talking about tracks he found near Sacred Ridge. Said they were wolf, but wrong, somehow." Denton made air quotes around the word. "You know how he gets." Luke did know. Thomas Blackfeather was the eldest member of the tribal council, a respected elder who held to the old ways. Some in town dismissed him as superstitious. Luke had learned better. "Where's Thomas now?" "Probably at his place on the reservation." "Why? You taking a sudden interest in ghost stories?" Denton chuckled. Luke didn't answer, his mind already mapping the quickest route to the reservation. Thomas Blackfeather's home sat at the edge of the tribal lands, a modest cabin distinguished by the colorful prayer flags that fluttered from its eaves. As Luke pulled up, the old man was sitting on his porch, carving something from a piece of pine wood. He showed no surprise at Luke's arrival. "I wondered when you would come," Thomas said, his weathered face creasing into a smile. His hands, though gnarled with arthritis, moved with precision over the carving. "Heard you were talking about wolf tracks," Luke said. Climbing the porch steps, Thomas nodded, his black eyes sharp despite his 80-plus years. "Not ordinary wolf. Spirit wolf, maybe. There's no such thing," the old man shrugged. "Many things exist whether we believe in them or not." He held up the carving he was working on, a small wolf, its details emerging from the pale wood. "You had a visitor last night," Luke stared. "How did you know that?" "The tracks tell stories for those who know how to read them." "Small one injured? Big one came to claim it." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "But that's not all that troubles you?" Luke hesitated, then described everything, finding the cub, the night in his cabin, the strange tracks in the morning. Thomas listened without interruption, his fingers continuing their work on the carving. "My grandfather spoke of wolves that were more than wolves," he said finally. "In the old stories, they chose certain men to protect. Men who protected them first. That's just stories. All truth begins as stories." Thomas held out the completed carving. "Take this. Keep it close. It will remind you that you are not alone in your watching." Luke accepted the small wooden wolf, unexpectedly moved by its simple beauty. "What am I supposed to do if I see this wolf again?" "You will know." Thomas's gaze drifted to the mountains. "But be careful. Others have seen the tracks too. Not all men respect the old ways or the old agreements between man and wolf." 3 days passed, with no further sign of the wolf cub or its mysterious larger companion. Luke resumed his normal patrols, though his route now took him past the spot where he'd found the trapped cub more often than necessary. The illegal trap was gone, removed by the poachers, he assumed. Once the snow had melted enough to make retrieval possible, on the 4th evening, as Luke chopped firewood outside his cabin, he felt it again, that primal sensation of being watched. He set down his axe and slowly turned toward the forest edge. There, half concealed by shadow and pine, stood a wolf unlike any he'd encountered in his years of rangering. Massive silver-gray, with eyes that caught the fading light like amber lanterns. Around its neck, clearly visible even at this distance, was a scrap of dark fabric, a piece of the jacket Luke had wrapped around the cub. Luke's breath caught in his throat. The wolf's size was impossible, at least twice as large as any timber wolf recorded in this region. Yet there it stood, watching him with unsettling intelligence. "You brought back the cub," Luke said quietly, the words escaping before he could question the absurdity of speaking to a wild animal. The wolf's ears twitched forward at the sound of his voice. It made no aggressive move, simply observing from the tree line. Slowly, Luke reached into his pocket and withdrew the small carved wolf Thomas had given him. He held it up, a gesture he couldn't fully explain even to himself. The wolf's head tilted slightly, as if considering this offering. Then, with deliberate slowness, it turned and melted back into the forest. Luke stood motionless. The carved figurine still held aloft, until the last traces of daylight faded from the sky. The next morning, he mounted a game camera on a tree facing the clearing behind his cabin. If the wolf returned, he would have evidence, something more tangible than a story that sounded like madness, even to his own ears. That evening, Luke left a portion of his dinner, venison steak, barely cooked, on a plate at the edge of the clearing. He watched from his window until darkness made it impossible to see, then checked the camera settings one final time before retiring. Sleep eluded him. Thomas's words echoed in his mind. Wolves that were more than wolves. They chose certain men to protect. Ridiculous. Yet he couldn't dismiss what he'd seen with his own eyes. At first light, Luke was up and checking the plate. The meat was gone. He retrieved the camera's memory card with hands that were not quite steady. The images on his laptop left no room for doubt. The wolf had returned, and the camera had captured it in perfect detail. Its size, when compared to the known dimensions of nearby trees, was astounding. At least 180 pounds, he estimated, and standing nearly 3 feet at the shoulder. Its winter coat was thick and primarily grey, with silver highlights along its back. The eyes, even in the infrared night images, seemed to glow with unnatural brightness. Most disturbing was its behavior. In one sequence of photos, the wolf appeared to look directly at the camera, as if aware it was being photographed. In the final image, it was closer to the lens than seemed possible, given the timing of the previous shot. Its gaze penetrating, Luke studied the photos for nearly an hour, his ranger's analytical mind warring with what his instincts were telling him. This was no ordinary wolf. Whether it was some genetic anomaly, an undocumented subspecies, or, as Thomas would suggest, something more mystical, he couldn't say. One thing was certain. He needed to keep this discovery to himself. If word got out about a wolf of this size, it would create a sensation. Hunters would flock to the area. Scientists would demand samples. The animal would be pursued relentlessly. Luke copied the images to a secure folder, then deleted them from the camera's card. That afternoon, he moved the camera to a new location, more carefully concealed. He also laid out more meat, this time closer to the cabin. As darkness fell, Luke sat on his porch, the carved wolf figurine in his palm. The night sounds of the forest surrounded him, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of pine needles in the breeze. Then cutting through these familiar sounds came a howl that raised the hair on the back of his neck. Deep, powerful, closer than before, a greeting. A warning? Luke couldn't interpret its meaning, but he felt certain it was directed at him. He stayed on the porch until the cold drove him inside. The carved wolf clutched in his hand like a talisman against the unknown. "You look like hell warmed over," Sarah Collins said, setting a mug of coffee in front of Luke. They sat in her small office behind the veterinary clinic. The space cluttered with medical journals and wildlife rehabilitation equipment. Luke had finally made the trip into town after a week of disturbed sleep and increasingly strange encounters with the wolf. "Thanks for the professional assessment," he replied. Wrapping his hands around the mug, Sarah studied him with clinical precision. "When's the last time you slept through the night?" Luke sipped the coffee instead of answering. On his last 5 patrols, he'd spotted the wolf, always at a distance, always watching. Twice, it had led him to signs of poachers that he would have otherwise missed. Once he'd followed it to a group of lost hikers. Hours before search and rescue would have been alerted to their absence. "I've been having some unusual wildlife encounters," he said finally. Sarah's eyes sharpened with interest. "What kind of encounters?" Luke hesitated. Sarah was the closest thing he had to a friend besides Jack. She was also a scientist to her core. How would she react to a story about a seemingly supernatural wolf? "Hypothetically," he began, "what would you say if I told you I'd seen a wolf nearly twice the normal size?" Sarah set down her coffee. "I'd say you're either sleep-deprived or you found something that could rewrite wildlife biology textbooks." She leaned forward. "Are we speaking hypothetically, Luke?" He pulled out his phone and passed it to her, the wolf photos already queued up. Sarah scrolled through them in silence, her expression transitioning from professional interest to open astonishment. "This can't be real," she whispered. "The largest grey wolf ever recorded was 175 pounds. This animal must be—" She trailed off, calculating. "At least 200, Luke finished for her. "Maybe more. Where was this taken?" "Near my cabin." Sarah looked up from the photos. "You've been tracking it?" "It's been tracking me," Luke said. The words sounded absurd, but they were true. "There's more to the story." He told her everything. The trapped cub, the storm, the impossible disappearance, and the subsequent appearances of the adult wolf. With each detail, Sarah's expression grew more skeptical, but she didn't interrupt. "Let me get this straight," she said when he finished. "You think this abnormally large wolf is the mother of the cub you rescued, and it's now, what, following you out of gratitude?" "Put like that, it sounded ridiculous." "I know how it sounds," Luke said. "But I've seen it 5 times now. It's always watching, always nearby when something significant happens." Sarah sighed, handing back the phone. "There's probably a rational explanation. A genetic anomaly, perhaps. Wolves from Minnesota can be much larger than our local population." She reached into a cabinet and pulled out a small box. "I have a radio collar that might fit an animal this size. If you can get close enough." "No," Luke said, surprising himself with the vehemence of his response. "No collar." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "That's not like you, Luke. I thought you'd want to gather data." He couldn't explain the certainty he felt. Collaring the wolf would be a violation of something he didn't fully understand himself. "Some things should remain wild," he said finally. Sarah studied him with concern. "You're different lately." "Ever since that storm." Before Luke could respond, her office door opened. Jack Peterson stuck his head in, looking surprised to find Luke there. "Sorry to interrupt," Jack said, "but you both need to hear this. They just found 3 dead wolves near Blacktail Ridge, poisoned, looks like. And there's more activity around that proposed hunting lodge site." Luke stood immediately. "What kind of activity?" Construction vehicles, security personnel, they're moving equipment in despite not having final approval. Sarah's expression darkened. Those wolves were part of the Blacktail pack. They've been stable for years, no livestock predation issues. Someone's clearing the way, Luke said, the pieces falling into place. Get rid of the predators, make the area more appealing for a luxury development. That's a serious accusation, Jack warned. These developers have powerful friends. Luke was already heading for the door, Thomas Blackfeather's warnings echoing in his mind. I need to check something at Blacktail Ridge. Luke, Sarah called after him, be careful. If someone's willing to poison wolves, they won't hesitate to make trouble for a forest ranger. In his truck, Luke found himself gripping the steering wheel with unusual tension. The radio collar Sarah had offered sat unused in her office. The thought of placing it on the wolf had felt deeply wrong, like trying to quantify something that existed beyond measurement. As he drove toward Blacktail Ridge, a flash of grey movement caught his eye. There, pacing him just inside the tree line, ran the wolf. It matched his speed exactly, appearing and disappearing between the trees. A warning, perhaps, or an invitation to follow. Luke turned off the main road onto a rarely used Forest Service track, following the grey shadow into the wilderness. Blacktail Ridge rose steeply from the valley floor, its upper slopes thick with old-growth pine. Luke parked his truck at an abandoned fire lookout and continued on foot, following the dirt track that wound up toward the summit. The wolf had disappeared, but Luke felt certain he was on the right path. The sensation of being watched, once unsettling, now almost comforting, remained constant as he hiked upward. He reached the reported poisoning site within 30 minutes. The Forest Service had already removed the wolf carcasses, but evidence of their deaths remained, disturbed ground, traces of blood, and the lingering scent that even a human nose could detect. Luke crouched, examining the area methodically. What he found puzzled him. No signs of the typical poisons used against predators. Instead, small fragments of what looked like tainted meat were scattered around. More precise than indiscriminate poisoning, someone had specifically targeted this pack. As Luke collected samples in evidence bags, movement in his peripheral vision made him freeze. He turned slowly, expecting to see the silver wolf. Instead, he glimpsed a human figure retreating into the trees, too quickly for him to identify. But definitely not a ranger or official personnel. Luke followed cautiously, using the stalking skills honed through years in the wilderness. The terrain grew rougher as he climbed higher, jagged outcrops breaking through the forest floor. The figure stayed just ahead, moving with obvious familiarity through the difficult landscape. When Luke finally emerged into a small clearing, the person was gone. But what remained stopped him cold. A makeshift hunting camp had been established in a natural depression, hidden from aerial view by overhanging pines. Not the typical weekend hunter's setup, this was professional, methodical. A leather case lay open on a camp table, containing what looked like veterinary equipment, alongside several vials of clear liquid. Next to it sat a high-powered rifle with a night vision scope. Luke photographed everything with his phone before examining it more closely. The vials were unlabeled, but he suspected they contained the poison used on the wolves. The rifle was custom-built, expensive, the kind used by professional hunters or military personnel. As he inspected the campsite, something metallic caught the sunlight. Luke bent down, picking up a spent bullet casing unlike standard ammunition. It was larger, with distinctive markings and a small engraved logo, a mountain peak inside a circle. Luke pocketed the casing, continuing his search. In a waterproof bag tucked under the camp table, he found maps of the area with wildlife migration routes marked in red. Several wolf den locations were circled, including ones not documented in official Forest Service records. Whoever was doing this had extensive knowledge of the local wolf populations and was systematically eliminating them. But why target only wolves, and with such precision? The answer came when Luke found a folder containing documents about the proposed hunting lodge. Initial plans, investor presentations, and most tellingly, marketing materials emphasizing a predator-free hunting experience as a key selling point. Luke's jaw tightened as the picture became clear. The developers weren't waiting for permits or environmental impact assessments. They were preemptively preparing the land by eliminating the apex predator that might threaten their wealthy clients' hunting experiences. He had gathered what he needed and was preparing to leave when a low growl froze him in place. Not from his wolf. This sound came from behind him, threatening and unmistakably canine. Luke turned slowly to face a large black dog, a Belgian Malinois, the kind used by military and security forces. It stood at the edge of the clearing, hackles raised, teeth bared. Behind it, a man in tactical gear emerged from the trees. Another dog at his heel. Forest Service, Luke identified himself, and moving instinctively toward his sidearm. "You're trespassing on private property," the man replied coldly. He made a subtle hand gesture, and both dogs advanced a step, still growling. "This is federal land," Luke countered. "I have jurisdiction here," the man smiled without warmth. "Boundaries have been redrawn. You didn't get the memo." Luke's mind raced. He was outnumbered and at least a mile from his truck. The dogs were trained attack animals, and the man likely had a weapon concealed beneath his jacket. "I'll need to see documentation of any boundary changes," Luke said. "Playing for time. Why don't you come back to our main camp? We can sort this out there." The man's tone made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. The dogs moved closer, their growls deepening. Luke assessed his options, none of them good. Then, cutting through the tension, came another growl. Deeper, more powerful, primeval. From the ridge above the clearing, a massive silver shape emerged. Luke's wolf stood silhouetted against the sky, its size magnified by its position, golden eyes fixed on the dogs below. The reaction was immediate. Both Malinois whimpered and backed away, tails tucking despite their training. The man's face drained of color. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. "I'm telling you what I saw, Hank." Luke stood in the district supervisor's office, struggling to keep his voice even. Professional hunters, poisoned wolves, and documentation connecting it all to Ironwood developments. Hank Mitchell leaned back in his chair, his expression carefully neutral. "And this unusually large wolf that supposedly scared off trained security dogs. You have evidence of that too, I suppose?" Luke hesitated. He deliberately left the wolf photos off his report, trusting his professional reputation to carry the more verifiable claims about the hunting camp and poisoned wolves. "The relevant evidence is all there," he said instead. "Samples of the poison, photographs of the camp, maps marked with wolf den locations that aren't in our records, which suggests someone in this office may have provided confidential information to these developers." Hank shuffled through Luke's report without looking up. "A serious accusation. I'm not accusing anyone specifically. I'm reporting what I found." Hank sighed, finally meeting Luke's gaze. "Look, Morgan, you're a good ranger. One of our best. But you've been increasingly, let's call it eccentric, since that blizzard last month. Taking unscheduled patrols, changing your routes, filing reports about poachers without solid evidence." Luke felt a cold dread settling in his stomach. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying take some leave. A couple weeks paid." "Clear your head." Hank slid a form across the desk. "The development at Blacktail Ridge has been through all the proper channels. See for yourself." Luke picked up the document, an environmental impact assessment with approval signatures from state and federal wildlife agencies. According to this, thorough surveys had found no evidence of endangered or protected species that would prevent development. "This is wrong," Luke said, scanning the report. "We have documented wolf packs in that area, protected owl nesting sites. The watershed impact alone should have—" "It's been approved at the highest levels," Hank interrupted. "Our job now is to facilitate the transition by looking the other way while they poison predators and destroy habitats." Hank's expression hardened. "You're not hearing me, Morgan. This is happening. If you want to keep your job, you'll get on board or at least stay out of the way." He tapped the leave form. Sign it, take some time. Come back with a clearer perspective. Luke left the form unsigned on the desk, turning to leave. At the door, he paused. Who's getting paid, Hank? Just you, or does the corruption go all the way up the chain? The district supervisor's face flushed red. That's enough. You're suspended, effective immediately. Badge and service weapon on my desk before you leave the building. Outside the Forest Service office, Luke sat in his truck, mind racing. Without his badge, he had no authority to continue investigating officially. But he had evidence, the shell casing, the poison samples, the photographs. He needed allies. Sarah would believe him, might even be able to analyze the poison samples, unofficially. Jack had connections throughout the county, and Thomas Blackfeather, the tribal lands bordered the proposed development. They would have their own concerns about the project. As Luke started the engine, his phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. Cabin compromised. Don't go home. No signature, but only a handful of people knew where he lived. It had to be Jack. Luke drove toward the reservation instead, taking a circuitous route and checking frequently for tails. The shell casing he'd found weighed heavily in his pocket, physical proof connecting the professional hunters to Ironwood developments. If he could trace the custom ammunition. At the reservation boundary, Luke noticed something unusual, fresh tire tracks on a rarely used access road. He followed them, eventually spotting a familiar truck partially concealed among the trees. Sarah's veterinary vehicle. He parked beside it and followed the sound of voices to a small clearing where Sarah and Thomas Blackfeather were deep in conversation. They fell silent at his approach. They suspended me, Luke said without preamble. Sarah's expression shifted from surprise to determination. We know. Jack called us. He thinks your supervisor is on Ironwood's payroll. Not just him, Thomas added quietly. The approval documents for the development were falsified. The tribe submitted formal objections based on historical sites and water rights. Those objections are missing from the final report. Luke produced the shell casing. I found this at their hunting camp. Custom ammunition expensive. Has this logo? Thomas examined it, his face grim. The mountain in the circle. Ironwood's symbol. They're not just building a hunting lodge, Sarah said. According to what we've pieced together, it's phase 1 of a much larger development. Golf courses, luxury homes, helicopter pads. They'll destroy the entire ecosystem. Luke felt the weight of his suspension pressing down on him. Without my badge, there's not much I can do officially. Thomas's eyes gleamed. Perhaps it's time to work unofficially. A familiar sensation prickled the back of Luke's neck, the feeling of being watched. All three turned as one toward the forest edge. There, half hidden in shadow, stood Luke's wolf, and behind it, almost invisible among the trees, were the shapes of more wolves, a pack, gathered and waiting. It appears, Thomas said softly, that you have allies we didn't count on. The tribal council meeting hall was filled beyond capacity. Members of the Blackfoot tribe sat alongside concerned locals, hunters, conservationists, and those whose livelihoods depended on the wilderness remaining wild. Luke, Sarah, and Jack stood at the back, observers rather than participants. Thomas Blackfeather commanded the room's attention, his weathered hands tracing the boundary lines on a large map. The proposed development extends far beyond what was publicly disclosed, he explained. These watersheds feed our reservation lands. These ridges contain burial sites dating back centuries. And here, his finger tapped a section marked in red, is where they've already begun clearing, without permits or consultation. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A tribal elder spoke up. What about the federal protections for the wolf packs? Circumvented, Sarah answered. The environmental impact report was falsified. It claims thorough wildlife surveys found no protected species that would prevent development. Another voice from the crowd. We've already lost 3 head of cattle to wolves this month. Maybe fewer predators wouldn't be a bad thing. Jack stepped forward. Those weren't wolf kills. I examined them myself. The cattle were shot with small-caliber bullets, then torn post-mortem to mimic predator attacks. Someone's manufacturing evidence to turn public opinion against the wolves. This revelation caused an uproar. Luke watched silently, struck by how thoroughly Ironwood had orchestrated their plan. Create anti-wolf sentiment, eliminate the predators, falsify reports, bribe officials. By the time anyone realized what was happening, it would be too late. After the meeting, Thomas led Luke, Sarah, and Jack to his private quarters behind the council hall. The space was simple but dignified, walls adorned with traditional artwork and photographs spanning generations. Thomas retrieved an item wrapped in soft leather from a cedar chest. "This was found last summer during a cultural survey," he said, carefully unwrapping a stone knife with intricate carvings along its handle. Carbon dating places it at over 3,000 years old. It was discovered precisely where Ironwood plans to build their main lodge. Luke accepted the knife reverently. Its weight felt significant beyond its physical presence. The archaeological value alone should halt development, Sarah said. Thomas shook his head. "We submitted the findings. They disappeared from the official record, just like the wolf packs and owl nesting sites," Luke murmured, examining the ancient tool. "They're erasing anything that stands in their way. We need harder evidence," Jack said. "Something that can't be buried in bureaucracy." Luke handed the stone knife back, but Thomas pressed it into his palm. "Keep it. It belongs in those mountains, like you, like the wolves." That night, they gathered at Sarah's cabin on the outskirts of town, neutral ground that was likely not under surveillance. Jack spread out county land records across her kitchen table. "Ironwood's been buying parcels through shell companies for 3 years, he explained. Most people didn't realize a single entity was acquiring so much land. The hunting lodge is just phase 1. Phase 2 includes a resort, golf course, and private airstrip. And the money behind it?" Sarah asked. "Foreign investors mainly. They're marketing it as an exclusive wilderness experience, where wealthy clients can hunt without the inconvenience of actual conservation laws." Jack's expression was grim. "The local politicians are salivating over the tax revenue projections." Luke studied the maps, the stone knife resting beside them. "We need to document what's happening at Blacktail Ridge. Get evidence of the poisoning, the unauthorized clearing, everything. Without your badge, you'll be arrested for trespassing if they catch you," Sarah warned. "Then I won't get caught." Luke traced the proposed development boundaries. "I know these mountains better than anyone. And I won't be alone." They all understood his meaning. The Silver Wolf and its pack had made their alliance clear. "I've been monitoring wolf movements with trail cameras," Sarah said. "The pack from Blacktail Ridge has relocated since the poisonings. They've moved to the north slope, closer to your cabin, Luke. Is that normal behavior?" Jack asked. Sarah shook her head. "Wolf packs are highly territorial. They rarely abandon their established range unless forced. But these wolves seem to be deliberately gathering. Thomas would say they're choosing sides," Luke said quietly. Neither Sarah nor Jack dismissed this, as they might have weeks ago. "We need to coordinate," Jack said finally. "I can get satellite images showing the unauthorized clearing. Sarah can provide expert testimony on the ecological impact. But we need irrefutable evidence of Ironwood's illegal activities." "That's my job," Luke said, his hand resting on the ancient stone knife. "I start tonight." As they finalized their plans, Luke felt a familiar prickle at the back of his neck. Through Sarah's kitchen window, he glimpsed a shadow moving outside, large, four-legged, watchful. The wolves were already standing guard. Darkness wrapped around Luke like a familiar cloak as he moved silently through the forest. 3 nights of surveillance had yielded valuable information about Ironwood's operation. Security patrols followed predictable routes. Construction equipment was left largely unguarded after midnight. The main security office, a prefabricated building at the edge of the clearing, contained what appeared to be detailed site plans. Luke adjusted the night vision goggles, military-grade equipment borrowed from Jack's days as a wilderness rescue specialist. Through the green-tinted visual field, he watched 2 guards make their hourly circuit around the perimeter. Flashlight beams cutting through the darkness below. He'd chosen his observation post carefully, a natural rock outcropping overlooking the main construction site, accessible only by a treacherous climb that few would attempt, especially at night. The stone knife Thomas had given him was tucked into his belt, more talisman than tool. As the guards disappeared around the far side of the camp, Luke slipped from his position and descended rapidly toward the site. He had perhaps 15 minutes before they completed their circuit. The Silver Wolf had accompanied him each night, keeping a distance but always visible at the forest's edge. Tonight was no exception. As Luke approached the first bulldozer, he caught the glint of amber eyes, watching from the tree line. Working quickly, he attached a small GPS tracker beneath the machine's cabin, Sarah's idea, to document exactly where the equipment was being used. He photographed the vehicle identification numbers on each piece of heavy machinery, then made his way toward the security office. The door was locked, but the window had a simple latch. Within seconds, Luke was inside, moving silently across the room to the filing cabinet. He photographed everything: work orders, site plans, contractor agreements, all bearing Ironwood's Mountain Encircle logo. A folder marked Security Protocols contained what he'd been hoping to find: a detailed schedule of patrols, security camera positions, and most importantly, documentation of wildlife management procedures. The clinical euphemism couldn't disguise the systematic plan to eliminate predators from the area. Luke was photographing the last page when headlights swept across the window. An unscheduled vehicle was approaching. He quickly replaced the files, slipped out the window and melted into the shadows behind a stack of lumber. A black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the security office. Two men emerged. One Luke recognized as Ellis Crawford, Ironwood's regional director. The other was a shock: Hank Mitchell, Luke's Forest Service supervisor. Luke activated the recording function on his phone as the men entered the office. "The tribal council is becoming a problem." Crawford's voice drifted through the partially open window. "Their lawyer is requesting an emergency injunction based on some archaeological findings, the stone artifacts." Mitchell sounded unconcerned. "We've already addressed that. The official survey shows nothing of significance. There's more. They've documented increased wolf activity along the North Ridge. They're claiming it's a previously unregistered pack that qualifies for protection." Luke smiled grimly in the darkness. "Sarah's work." Mitchell's voice hardened. "I thought your people were handling the predator situation. We've eliminated 3 packs already. But there's a new one that's proved elusive. Well, find them. The investors are flying in next week. They expect to see progress, not legal delays and wildlife complications. There's something else." Crawford lowered his voice, forcing Luke to strain to hear. "Morgan's been seen around the reservation. Him and that wildlife vet Collins. They're collecting evidence." "Let me worry about Morgan," Mitchell said. "Without his badge, he's just a disgruntled ex-employee making wild accusations. No one will believe him." "You don't know Morgan like I do," Mitchell continued. "He's stubborn, not stupid. He won't come at us directly. We need to draw him out. What do you suggest?" "His cabin. If something were to happen to it while he was, say, trespassing on Ironwood property, that might solve 2 problems at once." Luke's blood ran cold. They were planning to burn him out, maybe worse. The conversation shifted to logistics, but Luke had heard enough. He needed to warn Sarah and Jack, then get back to his cabin before Mitchell's men arrived. As he began his careful retreat, a low whistle sounded from the direction of the guard patrol. They were returning early. Luke froze, caught in the open with no immediate cover. A soft sound, not quite a growl, not quite a whimper, came from the forest edge. The Silver Wolf stood in plain view, moonlight gleaming on its coat. As Luke watched in disbelief, it began pawing at the ground and making small, distressed noises. The security guards spotted it immediately. "Holy shit! Look at the size of that thing." "Is that a wolf?" "It's huge." Their flashlights and attention focused entirely on the animal. They moved toward it, radioing for backup. The wolf retreated just enough to keep them interested, leading them away from Luke's position. A diversion. The wolf was creating a diversion. Luke seized the opportunity, slipping back into the forest and beginning the long circuit that would take him safely away from the construction site. Behind him, he heard excited voices as more security personnel joined the pursuit of the wolf, a pursuit Luke knew would be fruitless. By the time he reached his observation post to retrieve his backpack, the wolf was already waiting for him, showing no signs of the chase. "That was either the smartest wolf in history," Luke said quietly, "or I'm losing my mind." The wolf's only response was to turn and lope into the forest, clearly expecting Luke to follow. Luke's cabin was still standing when he arrived, breathless from running the final mile. No signs of intruders yet. He worked quickly, gathering essential documents, his laptop with the surveillance photos, and the few irreplaceable personal items he couldn't bear to lose. Sarah's truck appeared on the access road just as he was securing the last bag. She hurried toward him, face tight with worry. "Jack called," she said. "Mitchell's issued a warrant for your arrest. Criminal trespass and theft of government property. They're claiming you stole equipment when you were suspended." "Convenient timing." Luke tossed the last bag into his own truck. "They're planning something at the cabin. We need to clear out." Sarah shook her head. "Running makes you look guilty. We need to make a stand, use what we've gathered." "It's not enough yet," Luke argued. "We have photos and recordings, but nothing definitively linking Ironwood to the illegal wolf killings or the falsified reports. Then we need to force their hand." Sarah's expression was resolute. "Make them show themselves for what they are." Before Luke could respond, the sound of vehicles approaching made them both turn. Headlights appeared on the access road, multiple vehicles moving fast. "Too late to run," Sarah said, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling Jack and Thomas. We need witnesses." Luke nodded, mind racing. "Get inside. Lock the door." As Sarah complied, Luke moved to his truck and retrieved an emergency flare kit, standard Forest Service equipment for remote operations. He positioned himself on the cabin porch, flare in hand, and waited. 3 vehicles pulled into the clearing: Mitchell's Forest Service truck, a county sheriff's cruiser, and an Ironwood security SUV. 6 men emerged, Mitchell and Crawford among them. "Morgan," Mitchell called out, "you're trespassing on federal property." "Come down with your hands visible." "Interesting definition of trespassing at my own residence," Luke replied, staying where he was, "especially with Ironwood security in tow." "Does the sheriff know he's participating in a criminal conspiracy?" The sheriff, a heavy-set man Luke knew only casually, looked uncomfortable. "I've got a warrant for your arrest, Morgan. Let's do this peacefully." "Before you serve that warrant," Luke said, "you should know that everything happening here is being recorded and transmitted to multiple secure locations, including evidence of Mitchell's cooperation with Ironwood to falsify environmental reports and eliminate protected wildlife." Mitchell's face darkened. "He's delusional. Suspension has pushed him over the edge." "Then you won't mind if we all wait for witnesses to arrive," Luke countered. "My attorney has been called, along with representatives from the tribal council who have a vested interest in Ironwood's activities." Crawford stepped forward, his corporate veneer slipping. "We don't have time for this." "Sheriff, serve your warrant." Luke raised the unlit flare. "One more step and I light this." In this dry weather with these winds, the fire crews would take at least 30 minutes to respond. It was a bluff. Luke would never deliberately start a forest fire. But the threat had the desired effect. The men hesitated. "You're only making this worse for yourself," Mitchell warned. "Am I?" "Because from where I stand, a Forest Service supervisor showing up at night with corporate security doesn't look like law enforcement. It looks like intimidation." The standoff stretched for long minutes, tension building like a thunderhead. Then from the surrounding forest came a sound that chilled the night air, a wolf's howl, deep and resonant. Another answered from a different direction. Then another. The men froze, heads turning as the howls multiplied. Luke had never heard so many wolves calling at once, their voices blending into an otherworldly chorus that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "What the hell is that?" the sheriff whispered. As if in answer, shapes emerged from the darkness. Wolves, at least a dozen, materialized at the edge of the clearing, their eyes reflecting the vehicle's headlights like burning coals. And at their center, larger than the others, stood the silver wolf. "Jesus Christ!" Crawford gasped, backing toward his vehicle. "Morgan, call them off!" Mitchell demanded, his voice cracking. Luke almost laughed. "They're wild wolves, Mitchell. Nobody controls them." But even as he said it, Luke felt the weight of the silver wolf's gaze upon him. There was intelligence there, a presence that transcended normal animal awareness. The wolves began to advance, moving in perfect formation, not attacking but herding, pushing the intruders back toward their vehicles with deliberate, coordinated movements. "This is insane," the sheriff muttered. Gun half drawn, but clearly uncertain about firing on protected wildlife, Crawford was already in his SUV, engine starting. "We're leaving, now." Mitchell hesitated, looking back at Luke with naked hatred. "This isn't over." "Actually," came Sarah's voice as she emerged from the cabin, her phone held high, recording everything. "I think it might be." As the vehicles retreated down the access road, the wolves remained, silent sentinels around the cabin clearing. The silver wolf approached the porch, stopping at the bottom step, its amber eyes fixed on Luke. "I don't know what you are," Luke said softly, "but thank you." The wolf's only response was to sit, settling in as if prepared to keep watch until dawn. "They've frozen all tribal council legal actions," Thomas reported, setting his coffee mug on Jack's kitchen table. "Judge Peterson issued a stay pending further environmental review." "Peterson's brother-in-law works for Ironwood," Jack added grimly. "The system's rigged at every level." Dawn light filtered through the windows of Jack's lakeside cabin, where they had retreated after the confrontation at Luke's place. The wolves had dispersed with the first light, melting back into the forest like shadows, all except the silver wolf, which had maintained its vigil until Luke and Sarah departed. "At least we have the recording of last night," Sarah said, reviewing the footage on her laptop. Mitchell and Crawford showing up with hired security to intimidate a suspended ranger. That's not something they can easily explain away. "They'll call it a routine visit that we misinterpreted," Luke said. "Without proof of the larger conspiracy, it's our word against theirs." "What about the evidence you collected at the construction site?" Thomas asked. Luke spread the photographs across the table. "It's compelling but not conclusive. We need something that directly links Ironwood to the wolf poisonings and the falsified environmental reports." "The investors are arriving today," Jack said. "Crawford let it slip to a buddy of mine who works maintenance at the airstrip. Private jets, big money people coming to see the site before committing the next round of funding." Luke's attention sharpened. "If the investors are touring the site, then the principals will all be there," Sarah finished, "including whoever authorized the illegal operations." A plan formed rapidly. The four of them would approach the construction site from different directions during the investor tour. Jack would create a diversion at the main entrance, while Sarah documented wildlife impact at the watershed. Thomas would lead tribal elders to the archaeological site where the stone knife had been found, asserting indigenous rights to ceremonial grounds. Meanwhile, Luke would infiltrate the main camp to locate and secure the original, unaltered environmental impact reports. "We go at noon," Luke decided. "That gives us 4 hours to prepare." They separated to gather equipment and make necessary calls. Luke hiked to a ridge overlooking the lake, seeking a vantage point to study the terrain one final time before they executed their plan. As he crested the hill, he found the silver wolf waiting. It sat on its haunches, watching him with that uncanny intelligence. By now, Luke had stopped questioning these encounters. The wolf was what it was, something beyond his understanding but undeniably connected to him. "Big day," Luke said quietly. "Probably our last chance to stop this." The wolf rose and approached, stopping within arm's reach, closer than it had ever come before. Luke slowly extended his hand, palm up. The wolf sniffed his fingers, then, astonishingly, pressed its massive head briefly against his palm before backing away, a gesture of trust. Of alliance, Luke felt oddly moved. "I don't know if you understand, but we could use your help today." The wolf turned, trotting to the ridge's edge. It looked back once, as if to ensure Luke was following, then descended toward the forest. Luke followed, sensing the wolf had something to show him. They traveled for nearly 30 minutes, the wolf leading him along game trails he would never have discovered himself. The forest grew denser, older, until they reached a section Luke didn't recognize, despite his years of ranging these mountains. The wolf stopped at the entrance to a narrow ravine. Inside, concealed by overhanging rock and thick vegetation, was a cave opening. Luke approached cautiously. The entrance was low, requiring him to stoop. Within, the space opened up into a surprisingly large cavern. Shafts of sunlight penetrated through fissures in the ceiling, illuminating what lay inside. Wolves, at least 20 of them, including young cubs. Multiple packs gathered in one place, an unprecedented assembly. They watched him enter without aggression, some lying down, others sitting alert. "My God," Luke breathed. This explained everything, why the wolves had seemingly disappeared from their traditional territories, why they were proving impossible for Ironwood's hunters to eliminate. They had gathered here, in a location so well concealed that no human would find it without being led. The silver wolf moved to the center of the cavern, where a depression in the stone floor had been lined with pine boughs. It lay down, revealing what it had been concealing during their journey, a wound on its flank, partially healed but clearly from a bullet. Luke knelt beside the injured animal, which made no move to resist as he gently examined the wound. Not life-threatening, but serious. The wolf had been shot, likely during one of Ironwood's hunting operations, but had escaped. Yet despite its injury, it had come to Luke's aid at the cabin, had put itself at risk again. "You've been fighting them too," Luke said softly. As if in response, the wolf rose and moved deeper into the cave, stopping at what appeared to be a small alcove. Luke followed, retrieving his flashlight to illuminate the space. What he found made his breath catch. The walls were covered with ancient pictographs, human figures and wolves, hunting together. Images of men transforming into wolves, of great battles and alliances. The paintings were weathered, faded, but unmistakably old, perhaps thousands of years, and directly below them, carefully arranged, were modern items: a Forest Service cap, rusted traps, shell casings, a poacher's knife. Evidence collected and preserved by the wolves. "Impossible," Luke whispered, even as he recognized some of the items from poaching sites he'd investigated. The silver wolf watched him, golden eyes reflecting the flashlight beam, waiting for him to understand what it had been trying to show him all along. They were not alone in their fight to protect this land. They never had been. "You expect us to believe wolves collected evidence?" Sarah stared at the items Luke had brought back from the cave, her scientific skepticism warring with the physical proof before her. "I know how it sounds," Luke admitted, "but I saw it. And there's more. Cave paintings showing humans and wolves working together, dating back thousands of years, according to Thomas. They had reassembled at Jack's cabin, the noon plan temporarily postponed as they grappled with Luke's discovery. The collection of items from the cave lay spread across the table, shell casings matching those used in the wolf poisonings, torn pieces of camouflage clothing with Ironwood's logo, even a dropped wallet containing security clearance for the construction site. "The paintings could be explained," Thomas said thoughtfully. "My people have stories of spirit guardians taking wolf form, of special relationships between certain humans and the wolf people. But this," he gestured at the collection, "this suggests something beyond even those legends." "Look," Sarah interjected, "we can debate the metaphysical implications later. Right now we have physical evidence linking Ironwood to illegal hunting operations. Let's focus on using it." She was right. Luke gathered the items carefully, placing them in evidence bags Jack had acquired from a contact in the sheriff's department. Whatever their origin, these objects could prove crucial in stopping Ironwood. "We need to document everything properly," Luke said. "Chain of custody, GPS coordinates where each item was allegedly found. Make it impossible to dismiss." Jack nodded, retrieving his camera. "I'll photograph everything individually and as a collection. We need multiple copies of all digital files." "I brought this," Sarah said, producing a tiny memory card. "It's waterproof, shockproof, and has military-grade encryption. We can store all our evidence on it." the photos from the construction site, recordings of Mitchell and Crawford, everything we've gathered. As Jack photographed the evidence, Luke and Sarah consolidated their digital files onto the memory card. It was smaller than a postage stamp, but could store more information than 1,000 printed pages. In the wrong hands, it could be easily destroyed. In the right ones, it could bring down Ironwood's entire operation. The investor tour is scheduled for 2 o'clock, Jack reported, checking his phone. My contact says they're showing the entire property, including areas they haven't disclosed to the public. Luke studied the topographical map spread on the table. They'll start at the main lodge site, then likely move to the proposed golf course on the East Ridge. That's where we should intercept them. Why there, specifically? Sarah asked. Because that ridge overlooks 3 wolf den sites that were omitted from the environmental impact report. If we can get the investors to see actual wolves in an area that supposedly has none, we create doubt, Thomas finished. Enough doubt that they might hesitate before committing their millions. Their plan evolved rapidly. Thomas would bring tribal elders to assert ceremonial rights to the land. Jack would position himself to document the confrontation. Sarah would be prepared to speak as a wildlife expert about the wolf populations. And Luke would directly confront Crawford with the evidence they'd gathered. We should approach separately, Luke decided. They'll be watching for us after last night. As they prepared to depart, Luke secured the memory card in a waterproof case, then tucked it into an inner pocket. Every piece of evidence they'd gathered was now contained in this tiny chip, their most powerful weapon and their greatest vulnerability. Be careful, Sarah told him, their hands briefly touching as she helped him adjust his pack. Crawford's desperate now. Desperate men are dangerous. I'm counting on it, Luke replied. We need him to show his true nature in front of his investors. They moved out separately, using different routes to approach the East Ridge. Luke took the most difficult path, a steep game trail that security patrols would likely avoid. The silver wolf appeared briefly as he began his ascent, then vanished ahead of him. By now, Luke understood this as a sign he was on the right track. As he climbed, a helicopter thundered overhead, sleek, black with tinted windows. The investors arriving in style. Time was short. Near the summit, Luke paused to catch his breath and check his bearings. Below, he could see the main construction site bustling with activity. Vehicles lined the newly graded road, and a group of people in business attire were gathered around Crawford, who was gesturing expansively at the surrounding landscape. Selling the dream. Concealing the destruction. Movement in the trees below the ridge caught Luke's eye. Security personnel, more than he'd expected, armed and moving with tactical precision. Not typical construction security, these were professionals, mercenaries. Luke reached for his radio to warn the others. But before he could transmit, a voice spoke from directly behind him. I wouldn't do that. Morgan. Luke turned slowly to find Hank Mitchell standing 10 feet away. Service weapon drawn and aimed steadily at Luke's chest. You just can't leave well enough alone, can you? Mitchell's face was a mask of cold determination. Always the crusader, even when it costs you everything. Luke's hand moved imperceptibly toward his pocket. Feeling the outline of the memory card, everything they'd worked for, everything they'd risked their lives to gather. It doesn't have to end this way. Hank, Luke said quietly. Mitchell's laugh was hollow. It ended the moment you chose the wolves over progress. Now hand over whatever evidence you think you have. From somewhere below, a wolf howled, a sound filled with unmistakable warning. Give me the memory card. Luke! Mitchell kept the gun trained steadily as he advanced. No one needs to get hurt here. Luke held his ground, mind racing. Mitchell wouldn't shoot him. Too many witnesses nearby. But he couldn't let him take the evidence. This goes beyond me and you, Hank. They're destroying protected land, killing endangered species. How much did they pay you to look the other way? Mitchell's jaw tightened. You think this is about money? It's about the future. Pinecrest has been dying for decades. This development means jobs, tax revenue, tourism. At what cost? Luke countered. Once they've stripped these mountains bare, polluted the watersheds, and driven out the wildlife, what kind of future will that be? A twig snapped in the underbrush nearby. Mitchell's eyes flickered toward the sound, his gun following momentarily. Luke seized the opportunity, lunging forward and knocking Mitchell's arm upward as the gun discharged. The bullet whistled harmlessly into the trees as the two men crashed to the ground, grappling for control. Despite years behind a desk, Mitchell was surprisingly strong. They rolled across the ridge, each fighting for leverage. Luke managed to break free and scramble to his feet, but Mitchell was already up, the gun once again trained on him. "Enough!" Mitchell's face was flushed with exertion and anger. "I'm taking you in. Resisting arrest now, on top of everything else. You're not here to arrest me. You're here to silence me." Luke's hand closed around a rock, weighing his options. Before either man could act, a low growl rumbled through the clearing. The silver wolf stepped from the trees, its massive form tense, amber eyes fixed on Mitchell. Behind it came another wolf, then another, until a semicircle of predators surrounded them. Mitchell's face drained of color. "Call them off, Morgan. I told you before, nobody controls wild wolves. Bullshit. I've seen the footage from your cabin. They respond to you." Luke shook his head. "They're protecting their territory. The territory your friends at Ironwood are destroying." Mitchell's gun wavered between Luke and the nearest wolf. "Stay back, I'll shoot!" The sound of vehicles approaching on the road below momentarily drew both men's attention. The investigator was moving toward their position. "It's over, Hank," Luke said quietly. "Too many witnesses now. Put the gun down." For a moment, Luke thought Mitchell would comply. Then the man's expression hardened into resolve. "I can't let you do this." He swung the gun back toward Luke, but in that instant, the silver wolf launched forward in a blur of motion. Mitchell fired, the shot echoing across the ridge. The wolf yelped in pain, but completed its attack, powerful jaws closing around Mitchell's arm. Man and beast went down in a thrashing tangle. "No!" Luke shouted, rushing forward. The other wolves held their position as Luke pulled the silver wolf away from Mitchell, who lay clutching his savaged arm, the gun forgotten on the ground. The wolf limped to Luke's side, blood matting its silver fur where the bullet had grazed its shoulder. Voices called from below. The gunshot had attracted attention. In moments, the ridge would be swarming with security personnel. "Go," Luke urged the wolf, pushing gently at its uninjured side. "Get to safety." The wolf stood its ground, eyes locked on Luke's. Then, with deliberate care, it bent down and picked up something from the ground, a spent bullet casing ejected from Mitchell's gun. It dropped the casing at Luke's feet, before turning to lead the other wolves into the forest. Luke quickly retrieved the casing. Unlike standard Forest Service ammunition, this was a custom round. Engraved on its base were the words "Wolf Hunter" and "Ironwood's Mountain Encircle," logo proof that Mitchell was using specialized ammunition. Provided by the developer, he pocketed this new evidence alongside the memory card, just as Crawford and a group of men in expensive suits crested the ridge, followed by security personnel. Sarah, Jack, and Thomas appeared from different directions. Converging on the scene, Crawford took in the situation, Mitchell bleeding on the ground. Luke standing over him, the others arriving, and his corporate mask slipped, revealing naked fury. "What the hell is happening here?" One of the suited men demanded. "Mr. Hargrove," Crawford began smoothly, "just a minor security incident." "Minor?" Sarah interrupted, stepping forward. "Your head of security just attempted to shoot a former Forest Service ranger to prevent him from revealing evidence of environmental crimes." "What evidence?" Hargrove, apparently the lead investor, looked between them suspiciously. Luke reached carefully into his pocket, mindful of the armed security personnel, and withdrew the memory card. "Everything is here," he said, holding up the tiny device. "The falsified environmental reports, systematic killing of protected wolf populations, bribes to government officials." He looked directly at Crawford. "All of it. These are baseless accusations." Crawford sputtered. "Then you won't mind if we review the evidence," Thomas said, his elder's dignity commanding attention even from the wealthy investors. Before committing hundreds of millions to a project built on lies, Hargrove's expression turned calculating. Perhaps we should postpone the remainder of today's tour while we clarify these matters. For the first time, Luke allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. They had created doubt, exactly as planned. 3 months passed with the speed of seasons in the mountains, each day full of purpose, each night bringing new possibilities. Luke stood on his cabin porch watching the first autumn leaves drift from the aspens. The air held that particular crispness that signaled winter's approach, but not yet its arrival. "Final paperwork came through this morning," Sarah said, joining him with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "The Northern Montana Wolf Sanctuary is officially established." Luke accepted the coffee gratefully, its warmth a counterpoint to the cool morning air. "All 50,000 acres?" "Every last one. The development permits have been permanently revoked, and the land will be jointly managed by the Forest Service, the Tribal Council, and the new Conservation Trust." After the confrontation on the ridge, events had unfolded with surprising rapidity. The investors, led by Hargrove, had withdrawn their support from Ironwood upon reviewing the evidence. Without funding, the development collapsed. Crawford and Mitchell faced federal charges for environmental crimes, bribery, and falsification of government documents. Most surprisingly, Hargrove himself had approached Luke and his allies with an unexpected proposal, converting his investment into a conservation trust to protect the land in perpetuity. Whether from genuine environmental concern or simply a desire to salvage his reputation, the billionaire's resources had proven decisive in establishing the sanctuary. "Any sign of our friend?" Sarah asked, her tone carefully neutral. She had come to accept Luke's unusual relationship with the Silver Wolf, even if her scientific mind still struggled to explain it. "Not since last week. The wound healed well." Luke gazed toward the tree line, where he often spotted the distinctive silver coat among the pines. "Thomas says they're establishing new territories now that they don't need to hide," Sarah nodded. "The latest surveys identified 3 distinct packs within the sanctuary boundaries. Healthiest wolf population in the Northern Rockies, according to the university research team." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching. Jack's truck appeared first, followed by Thomas Blackfeather's sedan and several tribal council members in a van. "Today's the day," Luke said, setting down his coffee. "You ready for this?" Sarah smiled, her hand finding his briefly before they went to greet their visitors. The ceremony would be simple but significant. The official opening of the Northern Montana Wolf Sanctuary Research Center, housed in a renovated barn near Luke's cabin. What had once been a solitary ranger's outpost was now the headquarters for one of the most innovative wildlife conservation projects in the country, as tribal elders conducted a blessing ceremony for the new center. Luke found himself standing slightly apart, watching these people who had become more than allies. They were now his community. Jack had taken a position as head of sanctuary security. Sarah had relocated her veterinary practice to focus exclusively on the wolves and other wildlife within the sanctuary. Thomas served as cultural liaison between the tribal lands and the conservation project, and Luke himself had found a new purpose. Officially reinstated to the Forest Service with a commendation, he had been appointed lead ranger for the sanctuary, responsible for both protection and research. "Quite a change from a few months ago," Thomas observed. Joining Luke at the edge of the gathering, Luke nodded. "I never expected any of this. The old stories say the wolf people choose their human allies carefully," Thomas said, his weathered face creasing in a smile. "They saw something in you worth fighting for." Before Luke could respond, a familiar sensation prickled the back of his neck. He turned toward the forest edge, somehow knowing what he would see. The silver wolf stood in plain view, watching the ceremony from a respectful distance. But it wasn't alone. Beside it stood a smaller wolf with similar silver markings, and behind them, barely visible among the trees, were the distinctive shapes of cubs. "Is that," Luke began, "the cub you saved?" Thomas finished. "All grown now, with a family of its own." Luke felt a profound sense of completion as he watched the wolves. The injured cub, now mature, had returned with its own young. The cycle continuing, strengthened rather than broken by human intervention. Sarah approached quietly, following Luke's gaze. When she spotted the wolves, her eyes widened in wonder. "They came for the ceremony," she whispered. "They came to show us the future," Thomas corrected gently. As the official proceedings concluded, Jack called everyone together for a photograph in front of the new research center. Luke hesitated, his eyes still on the wolves at the forest edge. "Go," Sarah urged. "They'll wait." And somehow Luke knew she was right. The wolves would remain, not just today, but for generations to come. This land was theirs again, as it had been for thousands of years, before human development threatened it. And now, through an unlikely alliance between one man and one wolf, it would remain theirs forever. Luke joined the others for the photograph, but his thoughts remained with the silver wolf and its family, watching from the trees, guardians of a wilderness that would now endure. 3 months passed with the speed of seasons in the mountains, each day full of purpose, each night bringing new possibilities. Luke stood on his cabin porch, watching the first autumn leaves drift from the aspens. The air held that particular crispness that signaled winter's approach, but not yet its arrival. "Final paperwork came through this morning," Sarah said, joining him with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "The Northern Montana Wolf Sanctuary is officially established." Luke accepted the coffee gratefully, its warmth a counterpoint to the cool morning air. "All 50,000 acres? Every last one." "The development permits have been permanently revoked, and the land will be jointly managed by the Forest Service, the Tribal Council, and the new Conservation Trust." After the confrontation on the ridge, events had unfolded with surprising rapidity. The investors, led by Hargrove, had withdrawn their support from Ironwood upon reviewing the evidence. Without funding, the development collapsed. Crawford and Mitchell faced federal charges for environmental crimes, bribery, and falsification of government documents. Most surprisingly, Hargrove himself had approached Luke and his allies with an unexpected proposal, converting his investment into a conservation trust to protect the land in perpetuity. Whether from genuine environmental concern or simply a desire to salvage his reputation, the billionaire's resources had proven decisive in establishing the sanctuary. "Any sign of our friend?" Sarah asked, her tone carefully neutral. She had come to accept Luke's unusual relationship with the Silver Wolf, even if her scientific mind still struggled to explain it. "Not since last week. The wound healed well." Luke gazed toward the tree line, where he often spotted the distinctive silver coat among the pines. "Thomas says they're establishing new territories now that they don't need to hide," Sarah nodded. The latest surveys identified 3 distinct packs within the sanctuary boundaries. Healthiest wolf population in the Northern Rockies, according to the university research team. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching. Jack's truck appeared first, followed by Thomas Blackfeather's sedan and several tribal council members in a van. "Today's the day," Luke said, setting down his coffee. "You ready for this?" Sarah smiled, her hand finding his briefly before they went to greet their visitors. The ceremony would be simple but significant. The official opening of the Northern Montana Wolf Sanctuary Research Center, housed in a renovated barn near Luke's cabin. What had once been a solitary ranger's outpost was now the headquarters for one of the most innovative wildlife conservation projects in the country, as tribal elders conducted a blessing ceremony for the new center. Luke found himself standing slightly apart, watching these people who had become more than allies. They were now his community. Jack had taken a position as head of sanctuary security. Sarah had relocated her veterinary practice to focus exclusively on the wolves and other wildlife within the sanctuary. Thomas served as cultural liaison between the tribal lands and the conservation project, and Luke himself had found a new purpose. Officially reinstated to the Forest Service with a commendation, he had been appointed lead ranger for the sanctuary, responsible for both protection and research. Quite a change from a few months ago, Thomas observed. Joining Luke at the edge of the gathering, Luke nodded. I never expected any of this. The old stories say the wolf people choose their human allies carefully, Thomas said, his weathered face creasing in a smile. They saw something in you worth fighting for. Before Luke could respond, a familiar sensation prickled the back of his neck. He turned toward the forest edge, somehow knowing what he would see. The silver wolf stood in plain view, watching the ceremony from a respectful distance. But it wasn't alone. Beside it stood a smaller wolf with similar silver markings, and behind them, barely visible among the trees, were the distinctive shapes of cubs. Is that, Luke began, the cub you saved? Thomas finished. All grown now, with a family of its own. Luke felt a profound sense of completion as he watched the wolves. The injured cub, now mature, had returned with its own young. The cycle continuing, strengthened rather than broken by human intervention. Sarah approached quietly, following Luke's gaze. When she spotted the wolves, her eyes widened in wonder. They came for the ceremony, she whispered. They came to show us the future, Thomas corrected gently. As the official proceedings concluded, Jack called everyone together for a photograph in front of the new research center. Luke hesitated, his eyes still on the wolves at the forest edge. Go, Sarah urged. They'll wait. And somehow Luke knew she was right. The wolves would remain, not just today, but for generations to come. This land was theirs again, as it had been for thousands of years before human development threatened it. And now, through an unlikely alliance between one man and one wolf, it would remain theirs forever. Luke joined the others for the photograph, but his thoughts remained with the silver wolf and its family, watching from the trees, guardians of a wilderness that would now endure.